When narcissists realize you are not the weak, stupid person they thought, I want to sit with that phrase for a moment before we go anywhere else. Weak and stupid are not words that most narcissists would use explicitly out loud, at least not in the language they deploy when they want to maintain the performance of being a reasonable person who simply has higher standards than most. But underneath the language they do use, the subtle corrections, the gentle implications that you are overreacting, misreading, or simply not quite equipped to understand the full complexity of the situation, underneath all of that polished, deniable condescension is an operational assumption that functions exactly like those two words. The narcissist chose you in part because something about you read as manageable. They saw someone whose perception could be shaped, whose reality could be influenced, and whose responses could be anticipated and worked with in the way that a skilled manipulator works with predictable material. They did not choose you because you presented as overtly weak or obviously naive. In many cases, the exact opposite is true. The narcissist was often attracted specifically to your apparent strength because the conquest of real strength produces a far more significant supply than the conquest of something that was already yielding. However, something in the initial dynamic suggested to them that you were workable in the specific way they needed. In the operational vocabulary of a narcissist, workable is the closest word they have to what they actually mean, which is manageable. Underneath that more palatable framing sits something very close to those two harsh words that we began with. The moment they realize they were wrong, the moment their assumption of manageability meets the reality of who you actually are, what you are capable of seeing, and the specific quality of clarity you possess through everything the relationship required you to survive, that moment is profound. That specific moment is the core subject of this entire discussion. It is one of the most psychologically significant moments available in the entire arc of a narcissistic relationship. Stay with me, because what happens in that moment, what the narcissist does with what they discover, and what it means for every subsequent dynamic between you is something that most people who have lived through it have never had explained to them with the specificity it deserves. Let us start with what the narcissist's original assessment of you is actually based on. Understanding that initial assessment is what makes its eventual collapse so specific and so consequential. A narcissist's initial read of any potential relationship target is not a single evaluation made in a single moment. Instead, it is a continuous, largely unconscious process of pattern recognition that runs throughout the early stages of any significant interaction. It gathers data about what this specific person is going to respond to, what they are going to be moved by, what their particular vulnerabilities are, and how those vulnerabilities can be most efficiently engaged. This process is not calculated in the way that implies a person sitting somewhere consciously running analytical assessments. It is far more instinctive than that. It is automatic, built from years of practice at reading people for the specific information a narcissist needs. They are not looking for the information that genuine human connection requires. They are not seeking a deep reciprocal understanding of another person's interior life. Instead, they are hunting for operational information. They want to know what moves this person, what threatens them, and what they need enough to overlook things they would otherwise never tolerate. They want to see what history you have brought into the interaction that can be engaged with, sympathized with during the love bombing phase, and eventually used as leverage. The narcissist who chose you ran this exact process on you. They gathered this data and arrived at an assessment that felt confident enough for them to proceed. Somewhere in that assessment was the operational assumption that you were predictable enough to manage in the specific ways that matter to how a narcissist navigates a relationship. What they missed is what they always miss about the people who eventually produce this specific moment of realization. They missed the part of you that was not sitting on the surface. You were not concealing it strategically, and you were not presenting a false front designed to deceive them. They missed it because the part of them that reads people for operational data simply does not have sensors calibrated for the specific frequencies that matter most. The perceptive system of a narcissist is extraordinarily well developed for reading vulnerability. It excels at identifying what someone needs, fears, and values in ways that can be engaged with strategically. However, it is correspondingly underdeveloped for reading depth that is not a vulnerability. It cannot process the specific quality of perception that a deeply aware person carries without announcing it. It misses the kind of clarity that develops not through initial innocence being replaced by bitterness, but through genuine experience being processed with authentic honesty. It overlooks patience that is not passivity, but is instead the steady quietness of someone who has learned that understanding a situation fully before acting on it is far more powerful than reacting quickly. All of me and all of this was present in you from the very beginning. None of it was visible to the assessment process of the narcissist because that process was not looking for it. It was looking only for what it needed to find in order to proceed with confidence. And so it found exactly what it was looking for. It found the genuine vulnerabilities that were present. It found the real needs that the love bombing would engage with such apparent precision. It found the authentic history that would be met with such convincing empathy in the early stages. It built its entire operational map of view from those specific findings, and in doing so, it missed everything else. It missed the depth underneath the vulnerability. It missed the clarity developing beneath the confusion of the early dynamic. It missed the specific quality of attention you were bringing to the relationship. An attention that was from the very beginning registering far more than the behavior of the narcissist was ever designed to produce. This is the foundational irony of the moment of realization. The initial assessment made by the narcissist was not entirely wrong. The vulnerabilities they identified were very real. The needs they engaged with were genuine. The history they appeared to understand was accurately perceived, at least in its surface dimensions. The assessment failed not because it was reading the wrong person, but because it was reading only a fraction of the right person. It read only the part that was available to the specific kind of reading their system performs, while the more significant part, the part that determines who survives and who walks away with their sense of self intact over the long arc of this dynamic, remained completely invisible to an assessment that was never calibrated to detect it. The moment of realization is the exact point where those two parts of you become simultaneously visible to the narcissist. They see the part they assessed alongside the part they missed. They see the part they thought they were managing right next to the part that has been sitting behind the map the entire time, watching the management with a clarity and a specificity that the manipulation was never designed to withstand. The narcissist looks at you and realizes for the first time that there are two aspects of you where they thought there was only one. There is the one they mapped out, and there is the one standing behind that map, who knows things about the dynamic and about the narcissist themselves that the narcissist had no idea were being observed or understood. What actually triggers this realization is rarely a single dramatic revelation. It almost always arrives through accumulation, through a slow series of moments in which the expected response simply fails to appear. It happens when a manipulation lands differently than it was supposed to land, or when something in your behavior, your composure, or the specific quality of your reaction to something that should have provoked a predictable meltdown produces instead something the map of the narcissist did not predict and cannot immediately account for. The first few times this happens, the internal system of the narcissist quickly generates an explanation that preserves their original map. They tell themselves that you are simply having an off day, or that their approach needs a slight adjustment. They assume the tool needs recalibration rather than total replacement. They believe the map itself is not wrong, but merely being applied incorrectly, so the approach is adjusted. The tool is recalibrated, yet that adjusted approach meets the exact same unexpected quality of response that the original approach met. The recalibrated tool lands in the precise same ineffective way that the original tool landed. The narcissist consults their map once again, and the map still offers no adequate explanation for the consistent gap between what was predicted and what is actually being received. It is in this repeated consulting of a map that keeps failing to explain the reality of the territory that the true realization begins to form. This realization does not begin as a conscious thought, nor as an explicit acknowledgement that their initial assessment was wrong. An explicit acknowledgement of being wrong is simply not something the psychology of a narcissist handles gracefully. Instead, it begins as a subtle shift in the quality of their attention toward you. You will notice a slight recalibration in how carefully they are watching you. A new quality of alertness enters their interactions with you that was not there before. It is not the easy confidence of someone who feels they know their terrain completely. It is something far more careful, more monitoring, and specifically focused on gathering information that their original assessment failed to capture. The narcissist has started to sense that there is something inside you that their mental map did not register. Sensing this without being able to identify it clearly is the exact origin of the specific discomfort we are focusing on today. What that discomfort produces in their behavior toward you, how it changes every dynamic between you, what the fully realized version of this moment looks like, and what it means for what comes next, is precisely where we are going. The behavioral shift that follows this growing realization is something most people on the receiving end have experienced without having an adequate framework to understand what they were watching. That is because the shift does not look like what you might naturally expect. If someone who had been trying to manage you suddenly discovered that their management was not as complete as they believed, you might expect a retreat. You might expect them to pull back and conduct a recalibration from a safe distance while processing this new information. Alternatively, you might expect an immediate escalation of their existing tools, a doubling down on what has always worked before in the hope that increased intensity will produce the reaction that normal intensity has recently failed to yield. While both of those reactions do happen at different stages of this process, the first and most distinctive behavioral shift is far more specific and revealing. In certain precise interactions, the narcissist becomes almost imperceptibly more careful with you. They do not become kinder or warmer, nor is this a return of the love bombing that characterized the early stages of the relationship. They become careful in the specific sense of someone who is suddenly aware that what they are saying is being heard far more completely than they intended. They begin to sense, even without being able to articulate it, that the person in front of them is receiving not just the content of what is being said, but the very architecture of it. You are seeing the structure underneath the words, the hidden intention behind the framing, and the massive gap between what is being said and what is actually meant. The awareness that this level of reception is occurring produces a quality of self-consciousness in the narcissist that is genuinely foreign to their system. Their primary operational mode has always been the confident deployment of tools that have consistently worked. Now, the tools are still being deployed, but by someone who is, for the very first time, not entirely confident in the deployment. This self-consciousness is deeply significant beyond what it appears to be on the surface. For a narcissist, self-consciousness is not simply a fleeting emotional state. It is a structural disruption. The tools of a narcissist work primarily because they are deployed from a position of absolute confidence in their effectiveness. That confidence is not separate from the tool itself. It is a core part of the tool. It produces in the person on the receiving end the specific quality of certainty that makes the manipulation convincing. When you are unsure of what is happening to you, when a situation is ambiguous enough that your own perception feels shaky, part of what generates that self-doubt is the unshakable conviction of the person manipulating you. Remove that absolute conviction, and the tool loses a massive portion of its force. A manipulation that arrives with the layer of self-consciousness behind it is fundamentally different from a manipulation delivered with complete confidence. It carries a slightly different texture and a different quality of energy. There is a faint hesitation in the delivery that an awakening or empathetic person registers even before they can consciously name it. The gaslighting that comes from a narcissist who is no longer completely sure it will work lands very differently than the gaslighting that came when they had zero doubt. You having developed the specific clarity that triggered this realization in the first place, register that difference immediately. You feel the hesitation, you notice the self-consciousness. Noticing it confirms something you have been sensing for a long time but could not quite crystallize into solid knowledge. It confirms that the dynamic has shifted. You realize that something in the balance of information between the two of you has changed. You know more about what is happening than you are supposed to know, and the narcissist has begun to sense that you know it. Now it becomes crucial to understand the specific ways the narcissist responds as this realization fully crystallizes. This is the moment when sensing becomes solid knowing, when the failure of their internal map becomes undeniable, and when they look at you and comprehend that the person they thought they were dealing with is not the person standing in front of them. This realization does not produce a single isolated reaction. It produces a predictable sequence of responses. Understanding the logic of this sequence helps you navigate it without being destabilized by any individual stage. The first response in this sequence is testing. This involves a rapid, often subtle series of interactions designed to confirm or deny what the narcissist has begun to suspect about the depth of your clarity. They will say something that requires a very specific response from someone who is still operating within the false reality constructed for them. They will drop a comment that only makes sense as a neutral statement if you still accept their version of events, their framing of the relationship, or their account of who is responsible for what. They are watching closely to see if you respond from within their constructed reality or from somewhere outside of it. When you respond from the outside, giving the reaction of someone who sees clearly rather than someone whose perception has been successfully shaped, the confirmation lands. They realize you are not who they thought you were. The realization is now complete, and the sequence moves swiftly into its second stage. The second stage is often the most destabilizing for people because it is the most counterintuitive part of the entire sequence. It closely resembles the early stages of the relationship in ways that make it genuinely difficult to navigate without a clear understanding of what is actually happening behind the scenes. This second stage brings a sudden, significant increase in charm, attention, and apparent investment in the relationship. While it is not the full-scale love bombing of the initial idealization phase, it carries that exact same quality. There is a sudden warmth and an apparent genuine interest. You might have conversations that feel far more real than anything the relationship has contained in recent memory. They may display moments of vulnerability that seem infinitely more authentic than the performed vulnerability they usually deploy. This surge in positive engagement is not what it appears to be, nor is it what most people instinctively hope it is. It is not evidence that the relationship can finally become what you always wished it would be. It is not proof that the person from the beginning is still in there, nor that what felt real was actually real and accessible if you just create the right conditions. In reality, this behavior is a strategic recalibration. The narcissist, having confirmed that you are seeing things far too clearly, is now attempting to forcibly restore the conditions under which your vision was less clear. They want to reintroduce enough warmth, apparent realness, and emotional connection to soften the edge of the clarity you have developed.